What is an open source software audit? So basically what you're determining is what do you have, what open source software do you have, and under what license is that software. This process might also be referred to as a package review. And essentially at the end of all this, hopefully you're going to get a bill of materials about what open source packages you have and a bill of materials about what licenses. You might also end up with a list of the license requirements, which could be a list of all of the license requirements, or it could be whittled down to a more specific list depending on how you are using the software. And perhaps you might also get a list of licenses that have potentially conflicting terms. So why do you even care? You got it for free, and you've heard this is a great thing and saves you a lot of money, but you do need to care because for a couple of reasons. Unlike other software that you might negotiate a deal with, that includes warranties or support, open source software, generally, like I said, it doesn't have warranties, it's downloaded for free, so you can't really provide or purchase outside support if you don't know what you have. You need to comply with the licenses. Just like any IP license, you're not off the hook just because you happen to get the software for free. So if you distribute a commercial product, you're pretty much an easy target. All the companies I mentioned in that December lawsuit distributed consumer electronics. Distribution is maybe broader than you think. So even if you're not in the business of software development, the distributed product that you distribute that has software in it that might have come from somewhere else, you're still liable for that compliance with those licenses. You are using open source. Regardless of the reason for doing the audit, the reality is it's probably in there. Every audit we've done has found more open source than what the client originally thought was there. What are your options? You need an audit. Now how do you do this? How do you find out what open source software you have? You can just ask your developers or providers what open source software is concluded. That sounds pretty easy. Why wouldn't I just do that? Well, there's some problems with this. First of all, developers or providers might forget the things they included. Developers are under deadline. They might bypass policies to get the job done. You could inspect the files manually and look at the code to determine what open source software is in there. It's probably pretty easy to imagine that when you're talking about tens of thousands of files, it's probably not entirely realistic. There's some open source software scanning tools available as well, and then there's also commercial products like OpenLogic, OSS Deep Discovery. And then you may have services where you engage a company to perform an audit. A good scanner is going to use multiple techniques. You can imagine that the different techniques are good at finding different things. So for example, if the code has been modified, then perhaps a match based on the path or the name of the file is going to be better than, say, trying to match it to the code itself. On the flip side, if, say, a license header has been stripped or the name's been changed, then a source block match is going to be more appropriate or helpful there. So the bottom line is you need different techniques combined to have the most reliable results. So it's not an exact science. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. No matter how good the scanner is, you're still going to have need human eyes to check, discern, and research aspect of a scan result. So here's a list of some issues I've seen. These issues relate to identifying the licenses. Obviously, as a lawyer, that's sort of my big concern. But you can probably extrapolate the kinds of issues that occur to licenses with just trying to identify the code to begin with. It's all interrelated. You've got all these results, so now what? Now what do? You have the facts, but you don't have the legal analysis. You still need to determine your usage. So this goes back to that slide about distribution earlier. Your audit might list all the license requirements, and then it's going to be up to you to determine which are actually triggered depending on your use of the software. You're also going to have to figure out what compliance means. Like I said earlier, we don't have precedent on the interpretation of these licenses. So how do you comply with the many terms and conditions of all these licenses? Reasonable attorneys may differ on what compliance actually means, especially with some of the more complicated requirements. Are there incompatible licenses? Maybe they're at odds with each other. You need to know if there's conflicting obligations. Is it, for example, if you have two licenses that say a derivative work must be under this license, then you can't comply with both. So you're going to have to figure out a way around that. And what's your risk? Ultimately, you want to be compliant and protect yourself from possible non-compliance actions or infringement suits, but perfect compliance, especially without guidance on what and how things are interpreted in the license legally, may be impossible. So you might have to make some calls on that. So who should participate in an audit? It might be kind of obvious at this point that a cross-functional team is going to be key for this process. If you're doing it yourself in-house, you may have the developer do the scan and then take a first pass before handing it off to legal. If you don't have a legal background, you're going to want to pull in help for that, maybe researching the licensing during the process, or maybe coming in after the audit is done to figure out the analysis on how to comply and how to interpret the different provisions of the license. And you also always want to consider the community perspective. I mentioned, open source has some ideological underpinnings, and it's really important to understand this and how that works. Are there conflicts, or is compliance not possible? Sometimes it just isn't. But perhaps, don't not think to answer the easy question, can it be left out? It might be that this code isn't even being used, and only your developer is going to be able to tell you that. Maybe there's an alternative that's under another license. Or maybe you can ask the author to make an exception or license it to you under a different license. Sometimes that might not be possible. A lot of open source projects have many, many contributors, but that's not always the case. So, these are just sort of the obvious things that sometimes it's easy to overlook. And then, of course, the risk management, which we brought up previously. What are your sticking points? What's likely to get litigated? Who are the players? Who owns the copyright to the code? Has it been registered? All of this is going to sort of come into play depending on sort of your risk tolerance.